If there's no oil, what would happen? The ability to do good things, probably that way. How many cars could you have? You could probably have 5 cars. Right. But then the growth of the economy depends on
As I was wondering, what was the first product to have been traded in the history of mankind? So it struck me, what if it was humans, right? So this entirely changed the way we think about concepts like trade, market, economics, the polity of a country, and philosophy as a whole. Well, the reason why this thought struck me today was because of whom we have here. And welcome to Get Nuanced, sir. Dr. Byra Reddy, Professor of Economics and Dean of Academic Affairs at Alliance University. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Right, sir. So, as we speak, this discussion comes as timely because, we have 4 important bills tabled in the Parliament during the winter session, which is the Bharatiya Vayuyan Vidhayak 2024 and the bills of lading bills, banking laws amendment, and the railways amendment bill. So, while I was thinking about these 4 bills, 3 common factors that occurred to me was the first was about the idea of privatization. And the second thing is about protection of domestic markets and about digitization. So when I talk about an idea like privatization, I would like to begin with asking you how this idea of privatization snuck its way into India.
Oh, well, that's a very loaded question, Engels. Thank you for having me, and suffer me as
Our pleasure, sir.
I go through answering your questions. How did privatization snuck in a way? It's really a long story. I don't want to really bore you. At the same time, I don't want to really miss the substance. So it's in that context. Let's kind of go back to the unipolar and bipolar world. Though everything began from Industrial Revolution, we don't go that far back. We'll start from the unipolar and bipolar world. Rather, the bipolar world gave way to unipolar world. One thing, the Industrial Revolution gave rise to a lot of production and consumption. And in the human civilization, if ever the production and consumption were at its peak, it started at the Industrial Revolution and then it picked up, and now probably we are at the crescendo of the production and consumption. So in my view, the production and consumption is what led to a lot of things, including liberalisation, globalisation, privatisation, that we had to embark in 1991.
The LPG policies.
That's right. That's right. So let me start, as I told you, from the bipolar world. We had this Cold War, US, USSR, and then when US started stamping its authority over the world, and Cold War was decisively won, at least subtly, in favor of the US. That was probably the time when the seeds of privatization, the way we see it as a tree today, were sown. Yeah. So what actually happened was, the US economy grew the way it did, and then became very, very prosperous, and so much so that they wanted to ride that wave permanently.
Right.
The wave of prosperity, the wave of opulence, everlasting opulence, that way. So when they were thinking, okay, we're going to have this opulence forever, a couple of things struck them. One important study that happened in MIT around that time, let's say about 60s, 70s, right, was called the limits to growth. Right. So they really wanted to check if the prosperity is going to be limitless, right, or is there a limit to prosperity?
A limit to prosperity. That's interesting. That's pretty interesting.
So it was, limit of prosperity rephrased as limits to growth. Are there limits to growth?
Right.
It was an interdisciplinary study which decisively said that there are limits to growth.
Okay.
You can't go on growing like this forever.
We would like to know more about why that's the phenomenon behind it.
Well, like that's a very commonsensical phenomena to begin
Right.
with, in the sense that now there is a resource crunch that the humanity faces at one point in
Right.
time or the other. The resources are not now infinitely available. That way, that you could have no limits to growth.
Right.
Right, and particularly that the fossil fuels, the non-renewable resources will come to an end at one point in time or the other.
Right.
So therefore, there's going to be limits to growth.
Right.
That's basically the reason as to why the study concluded and said that there are going to be limits
Right.
to growth. And then there was also the other realization that stuck, so to say, opulent West, particularly the US and Europe, particularly UK, that the markets are going to get saturated at one point in time or the
Right.
other. And how would the markets, what do we mean by saturation of the markets? So let me kind of put it the way that all of us understand.
And when you say markets, it just strikes me that like we would like to call it modern markets, because like UK, when you mention, like I mean, like it's taking me to the colonial times as well. So I mean, like I would like to call it the modern markets. Please,
Yeah,
sir.
I mean, you could call it the modern markets, the neoliberal markets, if you wish. So it all kind of neoliberal markets, the origins of the neoliberal market happened at that particular point in time when they
Right.
realized that there's going to be saturation of markets. What we mean by the saturation of markets is, for a household of 4, how many cars could you have?
Well, one, I would say.
I would be more liberal because we are talking about the neoliberal markets.
Considering traffic in India, I would say no car, but still, I would like to answer your question. It's one. Yeah.
I very well understand you are answering this question from the current times
Right.
standpoint.
Absolutely.
But then like in the 60s and the 70s, the way they thought about this is, for a family of 4, you could probably have 5 cars.
5 cars.
Yes, 1 car each for each one, and then 1 family car.
Okay.
In fact, this is how
Right.
the economists in the US and the Europe thought. Okay,
Right.
for a family of 4, if you let loose, how many cars could you have? You could probably have 5 cars. Right. But then the growth of the economy depends on the continuous manufacturing of the cars.
Right.
What after a household has 5 cars?
Right.
They wouldn't
Right.
want the 6th. They wouldn't want the 7th.
Of course.
They wouldn't want the 8th.
Right.
Right?
There's a limit to it. Right.
Right.
Yes.
So that's the point. That's the point. So then, like car manufacturing will kind of dip.
Right.
Same is the case with the refrigerators. For a family of 5, how many refrigerators could you have? you could probably have 1,
Right. Yeah, one. That's
or
all.
let's say 2, 1 in the living room or 1 in the
Even
bar.
2 sounds like a very exaggerated number to me. But yeah,
Then,
I mean, yes.
if you kind of reimagine opulence of a kind, you could probably have 2, you could probably have 3.
Right.
But you are not going to have 20 refrigerators and counting. It's simply
Absolutely
not
not.
possible.
Yes.
Simply not possible. Same is the case for the televisions. How many televisions for a family of 5
Perhaps
could you
like
have?
one, I mean, like, since you're bringing these numbers, 1 in the hall room, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe 1 in the bedroom or something. Like, could be 2. That's all. Like, that's all I can imagine of.
Right. So I mean, like, I'll go all out and say each member has a bedroom of their own, 4 TVs, and 1 in the living room, 1 in the kitchen. You could have 6, and that's about it. Right.
Right.
But then the TV manufacturing continues to rise, continues to be in play.
Right. Right.
So that's where it stuck them. Look,
Right.
like we have to continue to produce cars, continue to produce refrigerators, continue to produce televisions, continue to produce every other consumer durable, fast moving consumer good that we are consuming in order to keep employing the population where they are employed.
Right.
In order to keep paying them the remunerative wages the way we've been paying them. Right. But then there's a certain limit to the markets. This US and let's say the UK market is going to get saturated. US and Europe market is going to get saturated. And after that, to whom do we sell the cars? To whom do we sell the refrigerators? To whom do we sell the televisions? So when the idea of the saturation of markets struck the US, let's say the West, and the West wanted to have more markets to keep selling the goods and services that they're producing, and their whole economy is dependent on it in terms of employment, in
Right.
terms of standard of living, in terms of being able to afford all that they've been consuming, right? So you have the limits to growth, you have the realization of saturation of markets. That's when the US and Europe, or let's say the West, thought we should have new markets. How do we have new markets? You will have new
Okay.
markets when there is an obligation.
Right.
Around that time, they realized one other, I would now call it in retrospect, fun fact, but it's a hard, real fact
Right.
that the developing countries were borrowing money from the Bretton Woods twins, IMF, World Bank, and then
Right, sir.
ADB, and
Yes.
then all of these financial institutions. And then, there were signs of these countries defaulting on their loans.
Hmm.
And when they're about to default on their loans, that's when the West thought we'll keep financing the IMF,
intervention.
World Bank. Exactly, right? They would intervene into it proactively in terms of providing funds to IMF, World Bank, ADB, and all other financial
Right.
institutions, so that they can continue to lend to the sort of say third world developing countries.
Right.
And when they're about to default on their loans, right? Through again the fund and the bank, right? We could prevail on them and say,
Right.
look, if you want to get rid of this vicious cycle of
Right.
defaulting on the loans, you need a structural adjustment program. And the structural adjustment program is the liberalization, globalization, privatization.
Right, but before you continue, like I have a question.
Yeah,
So
please.
these developing countries, right, borrowing an amount of money from the US through your IMF, World Bank, and the AD.
Let's say from the fund and bank.
Right, right. So now, is there a chance that like this is a design where the amount is so much so that this defaulting of loans is something which was expected in prior? Because I remember reading this book called The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. So it very much like it's resonating with the entire background as to like what you're offering to us right now. So I was just wondering if this was a design to make sure that these developing countries will run into the defaulting area.
I could probably answer this question another way.
Sure.
And that other way is, when the fund and the bank went on advancing loans to the developing countries, capitalized by the West, around that time, there was one other phenomena that was happening around the developing countries,
Right.
and that of populism.
Right.
So what I probably could do is draw your attention to a few populist programs that we had in our own country,
Right, sir. Yeah.
and then maybe tell you as to how our own country, went to the brink of, defaulting on the loans,
Right, right.
and got into the structural adjustment programs of liberalization, globalization, privatization. So let's go back to 1970s.
Yes, sir.
Around the time that you had the saturation of markets, you
Right,
had
right.
the limits to growth project going on. Around that time, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, in 1970s, came out with a very popular scheme called a 20-point
The 20-point program. Right.
So the 20-point program was basically a populist program which would make the poor better off by reeling out doles to them, right? So that was kind of the beginning, right? And then what happened? This was happening at the center in the
Right.
union government. Around that time, as though to fuel the center's populism, you had a very strange phenomena in South India. You had this film actor turned politician.
Right. We are all well
M.G.
aware of him. We all know
Ramachandran.
him. Yes.
Yeah. So he forayed into politics,
Right.
and pretty much on the promise that he would replicate his on-screen performance,
Right.
off-screen, but then on the political arena.
Right.
Yeah, promised a lot of these things, going probably 3 steps ahead of
Now I'm reminded of the
what
book
Mrs.
which
Indira
was
Gandhi did.
right.
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, now I'm reminded of the book called The Image Trap, which was written by M.S.S. Pandian. It's about this specific politician, about like how he transported his on-screen presence to off-screen area in the area of politics. So yes,
Right, particularly on housing,
Right.
particularly on employment. Right, he went all out telling people that like things are available for free, and I'll uplift you. You don't have to do anything.
Right.
You don't do nothing. Right, I'll uplift you.
Right.
Types. Right, and he was voted back to power. So around the same time, the actor turned politician in the neighboring state, Andhra Pradesh, Mr. N.T. Ramarao,
right.
got inspired by what M.G. Ramachandran was doing. I wouldn't find fault with either N.T. Ramarao or M.G. Ramachandran, because apparently it came out as if they wanted to be doing good.
Right.
So they wanted to kind of uplift the society. So N.T. Ramarao wanted to again foray into politics, imitating M.G. Ramachandran, said there's going to be 2 rupee kg rice, there's going to be free power, there's going to be free fertilizer, so on and so
Full on
forth.
welfare schemes, all out.
Yes, all out. You wouldn't get 2 rupee kg rice, you wouldn't get free power, you wouldn't get, let's say, free fertilizers. If you want to give them away free, you need to borrow from somewhere.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So M.G. Ramachandran, to give away homes, to give away employment, he was borrowing. N.T. Ramarao was borrowing for 2 rupee kg rice, free electricity, free fertilizers, so on and so forth. Elsewhere in the union government, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was borrowing to fulfill 20-point program, so on and so forth. This kind of had a domino effect of sorts. When every other politician in every other state started seeing Indira Gandhi doing this, getting back to power, M.G. Ramachandran.
It's a success
doing
model.
this. Yes, right. So, what is best to imitate? Success is
Right.
the best to imitate, right? So every other politician started imitating this. You could see, a broad brushing of populism in the 80s and the 90s.
Right.
The broad brushing of the populism of sorts, which kind of made the union government borrow. The external debt by the
Right.
union government went on piling up, and then the state governments went on piling up, and so much so that we saw 1991, right? We saw 1991 where you had just enough money to import 2 weeks of oil, right? So let me tell you a little bit of a story there again.
Right. A lot can happen over oil. You can
Yes,
say that.
a lot can
Lot
happen
can
over
happen.
oil. If there's no oil, what would happen?
The entire world is stuck. I can't imagine like any species of this world like moving on without oil. As of now, I'm saying it's very hard to imagine.
You're bang on there, right? I wouldn't get my morning newspaper.
Right.
I wouldn't get my morning milk. I don't have the university bus operating, taking me to the university.
Right.
I wouldn't have enough fuel to drive my own car if I decide to come by car. And that's the case for everybody else. The whole economy comes to a standstill.
Right.
Right? So that's how important oil is, particularly for India, which has been importing oil that
Right.
way.
Right.
Right? Dependent on oil. The entire infrastructure.
Crude
comes to
oil
a stand-
especially.
Yes. The entire infrastructure comes to a standstill.
Right.
Right? So therefore, when we stared at the situation of 2 weeks imports, is all the forex that we have, and we even flew a lot of gold from India to UK
Right,
to
right.
give confidence to our debtors that
They're doing well. Hey, we have
yeah.
a good CIBIL score kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, like we wouldn't mind pledging our gold, but
Right.
then we'll make sure that we repay you types. So that was the time that when the Indian finance minister and the prime minister went to IMF and World Bank, they were arm twisted left, right, and center to sign that they would adhere to the structural adjustment programs.
Right.
And the structural adjustment programs of liberalisation, globalisation, privatisation.
Right. The LPG.
Right. So that's how the privatization, liberalization, globalization made inroads into India. And that's pretty much how the liberalization, globalization, privatization made inways into the entire developing countries.
Right.
Right. The whole of sub-Saharan Africa, the rest of Asia.
The Latin
Right.
American countries.
The Latin American countries. Yeah. And in all of these places, you have the liberalization, globalization, privatization sneaking in,
Right.
right?
Right.
Through the defaulting of the countries on their loan obligations.
Right.
And the loan obligations started off, one for the need for consumption and
Right.
two for, the populism, right? And then the economy is not growing fast enough to repay the debt. Therefore, you defaulted. And when you defaulted, you had to adhere to the structural adjustment programs propagated by the fund and the bank.
Right.
Right. And everybody had to embark on the journey of liberalization, globalization, privatization.
It's like a situation that became inevitable. Right.
Yes.
So before I move on to the next question, I would like to thank you first, because you are a professor of economics, right? Like, so when we open our economics textbooks, it's more about the supply chain graphs which we have. But thank you so much for the lucid explanation of a very complicated process that happened. And so before I would like to explore more about the components of a lot of things which you told about. Since you mentioned about the USSR, right? And I'm gonna have to ask you about the digitization process in India, right? So let's talk about digitization. So when we talk about the USSR, so we had Joseph Stalin, who was more focused on developing socialism in one country, right? And perhaps in fact, Jawaharlal Nehru, I remember reading his book, The Discovery of India, right? Where it's more like he begins by saying I'm trying to reimagine India in the way I want to, right? So he mentions that he's drawing inspiration for socialistic principles for India from the likes of the USSR, right? And which is pretty much reflected in the Constitution of India through the directive principles of the state policy. Now, when I talk about digitization, right, I don't want to get into the tech savvy aspects of it, right? So a few questions which will be which might occur to anybody who's watching the podcast right now is that is digitization really necessary? That will be the first question. Is it necessary for a country like India? That's one. And second thing is, in a stage, right, where if we talk about India, we can say that we are one of the fastest growing economies, but still we lack in some of the aspects in the Human Development Index. It's a fact which is given by the UNDP. So when we talk about the democratization of this process of digitalization, so where exactly are we? And from that standpoint, what will be your view on digitalization as a whole?
Though I can directly answer this question in a couple of minutes, let me take an indirect route. We traveled from 1960s, 70s till 1991.
Right.
Yeah. And then I'll probably, go back to 1970s, 80s in a bit. But then let's move forward from 1991 onwards. And the way I painted the picture was that the West was a villain, and they kind of gave this recipe of liberalization, globalization, privatization to the developing countries, and that's
to the world in a way.
Yeah, to the world in a way, yes, because the major part of the world is
It's us,
outside
developing countries.
Europe,
Right,
outside
right.
the West. So yes, I painted a picture that way, which in some ways is the true picture. But then it so happened that the privatization, liberalization, globalization worked, somewhat okay with some countries, somewhat decently with some
Right.
other countries, somewhat very well with some other countries. And India was one of them that it worked, really well with.
Right.
And then you also had at the same time the IT revolution striking India, and therefore India did well since 1991 till now the way it did.
Which is why we are talking about Industry 4.0 right nowadays.
Right. So we'll leave that there. I'll come back there, and then you asked about USSR in the context of socialism of the USSR influencing India.
Right.
Right. It did. Right. In fact, in our constitution we say we want to achieve growth with social justice.
Right.
And if you reflect on growth with social justice, growth is a capitalistic term, and social justice is a socialistic term. So that irony of moving to all with capitalism is enshrined in our constitution. So that's how deeply ironical is our journey, is India's journey, right? And then like whatever happened in the USSR post Stalin, let's say Khrushchev and
Gorbachev.
We'll come to Gorbachev in a bit. Khrushchev, and at the same time you have Deng in Mao. In the China,
Right.
you had the Cultural Revolution. They tried everything that they wanted to try, but then things did not work, and both China and USSR had to embark on the capitalistic route in their own ways. Like China realized and they wanted to now get on to the growth route through a socialistic capitalism of sorts, which is still on in
Right.
China till date. Okay. And Russia, unfortunately, couldn't get there, though you have the 19 CPSU being, was responsible for dismantling the erstwhile USSR the way we knew it, right? And then Russia became the Russia that we know today,
Right.
right? And they also embarked on the same journey, but then didn't go anywhere. And digitalization of sorts kind of worked in its own somewhat okay way with the USSR,
Right.
in a very nice way for China, and in an even more nicer way with India.
Right,
So that's
right.
where let's get to digitalization as it stands today.
Right, sir.
Let's say if you look at the last 11 years, right? I say 11 years, keeping in mind the present dispensation.
Okay. Because I was wondering about like why the 11 years in specific.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, like there's so much of fanfare these days, right? Like to say, like the last 11 years has been the India
Okay.
has been,
Right.
and pre 11 years ago it was the different India, so on and so forth. I'm not taking any stand there,
Right.
any like position there, because I don't have a position except being a centrist. But then to kind of very objectively analyze digitalization that way, and the way the digitalization paved way for development, the way it happened, let's say in India over the last 11 years. In the 80s, Rajiv Gandhi said that of a rupee spent, only about 18 paisa reaches the poor. The other 82 paisa is kind of lost.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
That's
lost.
interesting. Okay.
Lost on account of rent seeking.
Right.
And rent seeking is the sophisticated economic term for corruption. bribery.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he said that, and his son said pretty much the same thing during the UPA 1, UPA 2 phase, right? I don't want to get into the numbers. Some
Right.
say 12 paisa, some say 20 paisa. Whatever he said, he still said 80 paisa, goes away, dissipates as rent seeking.
So just to reiterate, like a rupee we spend, only 18 paisa reaches the targeted beneficiaries you're saying.
You're absolutely right. So
Right.
1,000 crores we spend, right? Only 200 crores is reaching the intended beneficiaries. The other 800
Right.
crores is simply going away as rent seeking, as corruption, not by one stakeholder, but many
Distributed
stakeholders.
across.
Oh yes, many stakeholders, right?
Sir.
And that you could say as an objective fact of sorts, right? What happened during the current dispensation is you imagined a situation where every beneficiary has a bank account.
Right.
Every beneficiary has a bank account because Indira Gandhi nationalized banks,
Right.
like, and
I think like we're gonna get
and-
there. Yeah.
yeah. So when Indira Gandhi nationalized the banks, every nook and corner of the country had banks, right? So every beneficiary in every nook and corner of the country could have a bank account.
Right.
And the government ran the program of making sure that everybody has a bank account.
Right.
Right? And then talking about digitalization of that type, where you could imagine a scheme such as direct benefit transfer.
The DBT.
Yeah.
Right.
So now imagine, like 1,000 crores, right? You're spending the way you're spending, during the 80s, during the 90s, during the 2000s, right? But 2000s, the whole of that decade, you have a lot of this money, going away, not reaching the intended beneficiary, including Narega.
Right.
Right.
The Manarega based
Yeah.
program. Yeah.
So when you had the bank accounts for the beneficiaries, and then you have this 1,000 crores being transferred to the banks,
Right.
right? You have all of that reaching the intended beneficiary.
Well, that ensures transparency and accountability in a way.
Yeah, transparency and accountability for sure is. But for me, what is more important is flipping that whole cause of development.
Right.
The whole cause of development was only 20% there.
Right.
And the whole cause of development became 100%. When it becomes 100%, the kind of impact that you make is huge.
Right.
So that's pretty much what happened through, let's say, digitalization the way we see it today, and the way digitalization is kind of being the game changer of sorts, which changed the narrative and the actual cause of development the way it did, right? So that's that.
Right. So throughout this, like coming back to the bills, like Bharatiya Vayuyan Vidyayak 2024,
Okay,
which
yeah.
focuses on the aerospace industry, if I'm not wrong.
Mhm.
Right. So I was just going through this interesting program called the Artemis program, if I'm not wrong. So it's proposed by the NASA. So which basically says like they're aiming to land
Mhm.
the first woman
Mhm.
and the first person of color on the moon,
Mhm.
which sounds like it's a noble cause that they are working on. So similar to that, like recently we had the Chandrayaan launch, and which we all Indians are proud about. So with regards to this particular bill, where do you think like the industry of aerospace is headed towards in terms of achieving the Viksit Bharat 2047, India's vision of becoming a developed nation?
Let me kind of peg you back. Are you really talking about the 4 bills
Right.
which got introduced in the parliament
sir.
recently, and the 25th
Right.
they become they come into force. So let me talk about that, and then let me answer your question
Sure.
on
Yes.
the aviation and aerospace, the way you put it. If you are talking about the Bharatiya Vayuyan bill, right? Vidayak, as it is called.
Right.
This replaces the 1934's Indian Aviation Act, and which makes which gives a different legal standing for DGCA, different legal standing for the entity which is responsible for security and security within the aviation sector, which gives a legal standing for the entity which would investigate into airline accidents.
Right.
So the 1934 is a colonial legacy, right?
Right.
So this bill is essentially doing away with the colonial legacy of that sort, and giving it the framework that is required in the present day,
Right.
considering the challenges and the opportunities that we have in the present day,
Right.
right? So that's with respect to that bill, right? So which in a way is supporting the next level of reforms. Whatever we had, liberalisation, globalisation,
Right.
privatization, then you said we need the second generation reforms, we need the third
Right.
generation reforms, probably the fourth generation reforms with respect to the privatization, globalization, and liberalization, all
Right.
of them, all of them. So then you look at the Ladding Bill, the Ladding Bill replaced the 1856
Okay.
Ladding Bill,
Right.
which is again the colonial legacy.
Right. Dates back to a
Right.
long time ago.
Oh
Right.
yeah, and then the contract between the shipper and the transporter,
Right.
the sailor, the is now like rearticulated in a way that it kind of tests the challenges and the scrutiny of the current times in terms of the goods, in terms of their security, in
Right.
terms of the way they need to be transported, so on and so forth, right?
Right. Right.
So that's again, like doing away with the colonial legacy and then giving way for the privatization, the way the privatization is imagined today,
Right.
right? And then if you talk about the railways bill, which is replacing the 1905 railway board bill,
Right, sir.
right, and integrating that into the 1989 railways bill.
Right.
The 1989 railways bill articulated everything except the railway board because it wanted to kind of give the autonomy of the railway board, maintain the autonomy of
Right.
the railway board the way it was. And now you have merged that into the 1989 railway board bill so that it's all one bill, and then
Right.
we have ease of governance, so to say. And then there are some offshoots of privatization, which would kind of, uh, uh, which will be bought into railways the way railways would work. The railways would start operating. Yes,
Right.
like that's that. And then the fourth bill is your banking bill.
Yes, like before we talk about the
Yeah.
banking bill, so I remember coming across the banking companies ordinance, and since you mentioned about the nationalization of banks, which happened in two phases in India, one is in 1969 and the other is in 1980, right? So this particular bill, which is on the table right now, the Banking Bills Amendment Act 2024, although it covers about the structural reforms and also covering important topics like substantial interest, but since we have you here, right, I would like to go a bit off the topic. It's not completely off, I would say, but which is something which is not explicitly connected, right? The nationalization, when we talk about nationalization of banks, there are a few concerns, which we cannot surpass, which is about the privatization of banks, right? I'm not sure if we can call it as a risk of privatization of banks, or is it about a competitive edge that we are introducing, right? But however, when we speak about privatization of banks, right, which is a concern, right, how does it affect the NPAs, which is the non-performing assets? That's one thing. But on the other hand, when we talk about the bottom to top approach, how would this affect the cooperative banks? Because it plays a real crucial role in rural development and other affirmative actions in India. So how do we view these things through the prism of this act?
It's pretty broad a question, quite broad indeed. First, let me stick to the bill.
Right.
The scope of the bill is to make sure that the governance within the banking is kind of shaken off from
Right.
whatever RBI's control that was there on the banking sector. Like, for instance, RBI would decide who should be your auditor if you are the bank, right? The bill says RBI will not decide, you decide hereafter as to who your
Right.
auditor is going to be. And then more than one nominee into the accounts.
Yes, multiple
right?
nominees,
Multiple
right.
nominees. So that you don't have to park huge, wealth wherever that huge wealth is there in the
Right.
bank into one individual, but multiple entities.
They're also
and multiple-
redefining the timeline of this fortnight, I believe, right?
Uh-huh.
Like, yeah, it's going to be from the 1st of each month to the 15th or 16th of each month and the other way around. Yeah, it's altering like a lot of things, right?
Right. So the scope of the bill is to, let's say, make the banking sector more competitive,
Right?
right? So that RBI would say only so much is going to be paid to the auditor, and therefore only such type of an auditor is available, and therefore the auditing is not done well. So you want to move away from that situation to a situation where like you see a competent auditor to your bank, you get that auditor, you get your bank audited that way, so that you really know what is your bank's
Health.
financial health, right? So that's one thing. The nominations is one thing. Now coming back to the question that you asked in terms of NPAs, does it have anything to do with NPAs? I would say not particularly this bill, right? So if you look at the Insolvency Act, right? The Insolvency Act had something directly to do with the NPAs.
Right.
So like the restructuring of the loans,
Right.
the Indian government could have created a bad bank and dumped all the NPAs there.
Right.
Right. They didn't do that. They did something else to the effect of restructuring the liabilities in such a way that you could sell the entire bad asset to somebody else who could turn it into a good asset.
Right. Right.
So that's why the NPAs are probably India's NPAs today is the best in terms of being the lowest, right?
Okay.
Compared to any other country. The banking health in India is great. It's because of the way you have an insolvency bill of a type.
Insolvency
where-
and bankruptcy code.
Right. So the code itself is such that the asset is not left to decay and die. It's sold. It's sold to somebody else.
Right.
And whatever else is the difference that you could make up by selling the assets, right? So NPAs are not going to be the way NPAs were in the Indian banking sector hereafter. So this bill has nothing directly to do with NPAs
Right.
as such. What was your other thing?
So I was asking about, like, on one side, like, although we look at NPAs,
Yeah.
like the role of cooperative banks in India, right? Like that plays a major role. And I think like the bill talks about the tenure of directors of cooperative banks. And if I'm not wrong, like the tenure of directors has been extended from 8 to 10 years, but the exception applies to the director appointed by the RBI and to cooperative banks. But although like not talking about the tenure period of this particular bill, I would like to know more about the state of cooperative banks in India. What would be your opinion?
See, I mean, if there is any segment which needs reforms in India, it's the non-banking financial sector
Right.
and the cooperative banks. And I mean, like, these are the ones which, I mean, if you anytime hear about a run on a bank, you are hearing about a cooperative bank.
Right.
You're not hearing so much about the proper commercial banks the way we know them, right? That's because like you have so much more free space there to kind of take unnecessary risk in order to get higher returns,
Right.
and which is what making these cooperative banks go bankrupt,
Right.
go on the run, right? So this particular bill is now kind of shaking off that bit of the code,
Right.
which would say, like, your directors will have to be A, B, C, D, and their tenure will have to be, X, Y, Z,
Right.
so on and so forth. So it's again giving it back to the banks, and then asking them to decide. You decide.
So a sense of autonomy to them. Right.
Yes, of course.
Right.
The flip side of it, the way the opposition parties are arguing is, like, would this give way to a situation where, there's going to be altogether another line that the banking sector could trod? It could.
Right.
It could. There's always that other side of the coin to any bill,
Absolutely.
any reform.
Right.
But then, when in the capitalistic ecosystem, when you want to be better than me, and when both of us are banks, right?
Right.
You would want to appoint a director who knows banking well than a director whom the government says, no, you should appoint,
Right.
right? And the tenures you could determine. You could determine who is better for you rather than the government deciding, like, who is better for you.
Absolutely, sir.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm really thankful that you answered that question, because like when we talk about the subject of economics, like, and when we talk about banking in specific, all we hear about is there are like three major terms which occurs to me. One is the inflation, the other is the repo rate, reverse repo rate, and stuff like that. So thank you so much for answering that. And so we look forward to all the bills being discussed. Thank you for your examination. It was very analytical in nature. And thanks for the historical trajectory you brought in for all these things, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.